Again, on behalf of the Iraqi Cultural Club, the newly established club, I'd like to welcome everybody here. I would like also to congratulate the small number of Iraqi students who took the initiative, and I will mention the cabinet only, and I wish them the best. And this is the opening of the inaugurating event of the activities of the club is a telling about their kind of interest and aspirations. I would like to congratulate Jafar Hadi, who is the president of the club, Yahya Al-Yahya, Teresa Lahib, Muzaffar Amin, and Al-Faqar Hafiz. These are the members of the club, and I wish them the best of luck. I would like to thank them as well for asking me to be the advisor of the club. I'm not Iraqi myself. I lived as a teenager for a few years in Iraq during the good old horrible days of Saddam Hussein's dictatorship. I was a teenager at that point, but I still had the opportunity to have a small portion of what other Iraqis were, the bitter taste of Iraqi experience during that time. Before the age of 16, I was arrested by the Mukhabarat with my father, and I had the nightmarish privilege of being interrogated by Barazan Takriti. I don't know why would he interrogate somebody at my age, but it seems like he was not very busy at the time. But I survived. I was released shortly after, and I left the country. I was evacuated from the country with my family. But I left in one piece, which was a fortunate thing that not many Iraqis have had. Iraq itself was released from that prison years after that. Whether it's released in one piece or not, we're not so sure, but we hope so, and eventually. What we know, at least now, that the destiny of Iraq is to a great extent in the hands of the Iraqis. And it's the hand of the future generations now of Iraqis, and among those are the students here in AUB, who we hope they will be among educated elite who will play a role in reshaping their own country and perhaps influence the region as well in all positive ways. Being in Lebanon, for them, I think it's a great opportunity to understand themselves through understanding the region and the world around them. And I think this initiative is part of that attempt. And I think the idea to invite our distinguished guest, Dr. Allawi, fits within that attempt to understand oneself and others. Let me present our speaker here. I'm sure many of you know him very well, but let me say a few words about Dr. Allawi. Dr. Allawi has a distinguished career, both academically, intellectually, and politically. To go back to the times of the youth, he earned his civil engineering degree from MIT, and then later his MBA from Harvard Business School. He had a distinguished political career. He became a minister of trade and of defense, and later on in finance in Iraq. He is the author of several important books. One about the post-invasion or post-liberation, whatever you want to call it, of American occupation of Iraq, called the occupation winning the war and losing the peace, which was called by New York Times Review of Books as one of the most comprehensive account of the aftermath of the American invasion of Iraq. He was also the author of another important book, The Crisis of Islamic Civilization, which was given a silver prize by the Washington Institute for an Eastern Policy. And more recently, he's the author of a book on Faisal I, called Faisal I of Iraq, which was listed by The Economist as one of the best books of 2014. It's also a deep and comprehensive account of the period of Faisal I after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. And I think now he's working on a book commissioned by Yale University Press. It's an economic history of the developing world, and we're looking forward to that one as well. Dr. Allawi also held many positions, academic positions, in the National University of Singapore, Oxford University. He was a visiting fellow at Princeton, Kennedy School of Government, and many other places. He holds a distinguished fellowship, professorship from the Institute of Technological University at Nanyang in Singapore. And he was going to give us a vision of the future. And the title of his paper is Iraq, Linchpin of Middle East Confederation, the view from 2040. So his optimism, we can't judge whether this works or not because he throws the prediction far away. I think it's a wise thing. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Allawi as our guest.
Thank you very much, Professor Bashar, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The reason why I chose 2040 as the end point is because it's highly likely I will not be around to witness the outcome, so I won't be around to be judged for it. But looking at it really from another perspective, I didn't want to devote much time to analyzing and assessing the current situation and why we're in such dire straits and why the whole area is up in flames and so on. I'm sure there are enough writers, thinkers, professors, pundits, and so on to give us all kinds of explanations. What I wanted to focus on today is where is it that we could be going? What kind of outlook, what kind of futures can we aspire to realistically, and what needs to be done in order to achieve these futures? Because if we just replay the past, we're quite likely to repeat its outcome. If we're going to keep on playing the politics of conflicts and divisions and beggar thy neighbor, it is highly likely that a similar set of circumstances will occur somewhere down the line, which will set us way, way back again. There's no doubt that what started off as a type of vision of freedom in 2010, the so-called Arab Spring, deteriorated into one of the most protracted and difficult periods in which the area has gone through. And if you look at it in terms of just the economic aspects of it, decades of economic growth have been thrown away as a result of the strife and conflicts and divisions that arose as in consequence of that. And I'm of the opinion that if we're going to repeat these errors, or if we continue along this path, maybe we'll not get exactly the same kind of outcomes, but it is highly probable that we will be set back again on the path towards actualizing our potential. The other aspect of this talk is that we're nearly 100 years, nearly exactly, after the end of World War I, when the makeup of the Middle East, or what I prefer to call actually West Asia, was defined. Of course, it didn't come out of the blue that we got this nation-state system that has been so problematic in the last 100 years. It came as a result of all kinds of deals and compromises and all kinds of attempts to square circles, and also the fact that by the end of World War I, there were 900,000 Allied troops in this part of the world, which had their own rationalization as to what kind of outcome was likely to happen. And I think no sane person would say that the state system that has evolved in the last 100 years in the Middle East or in West Asia has been in any way or form stable. Of course, you can make the same argument for places in Europe. I mean, Europe has hardly been a stable continent in the last 100 years either, and all kinds of boundaries have shifted, empires have fallen, states have risen and collapsed. So we're really in quite good company. But after World War II, the institutions of a post-war order came about, which, whatever we think of them as perhaps colonized or neo-colonized peoples, provided a great deal of security and stability, at least for the peoples of Europe, and created institutions and structures of government and governance that made it quite difficult to contemplate the wars and conflicts of the past. Of course, it might be a bit disingenuous to talk about regional integration and confederations and so on, with Britain about to pull out of the European Union. But I think Britain pulling out of the European Union does not in any shape or form deny the importance and significance of regional integration. So the gist of my talk is that after the conflicts of the last, depending where you look at it, in the last few years or the last decade or decades, if you're an Iraqi, obviously the conflict started perhaps in 1958, perhaps in 1968, or perhaps in the Iraqi invasion of Iran and in the Iran-Iraq war. Or they might have started in 1991. If you look at it from the perspective of this country, the conflicts and divisions started somewhere in the mid-1970s and escalated and retracted and has gone into some kind of deep freeze here, some kind of collective amnesia. In the case of Syria, which was supposed to be a stable state, by every standard that the World Bank has used, if you read the World Bank reports on Syria, prior to 2010, all they talk about is how stable the system is. Who would have thought 5 years ago or 6 years ago that we've ended up in this mess that we have? The other part of this equation, what I call the post-Ottoman order in the Middle East, out of which the nation-state system evolved, which is Iraq, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine. Jordan is hardly a stable entity. If one remembers that something like a third of its territory was hived off in 1967 and is about to disappear completely if Mr. Netanyahu comes back to power. So if you look at it, if the glass is half full or half empty, I mean, if you look into the future, looking back, I prefer to see it half full. And I prefer to say that this area has been given a second chance to reconfigure its political system and its political order and its economic order in order to create the structures of stability and continuity that hopefully will give the people of this area a better chance of actualizing their potential. So it's not so much a peek into the future, but rather the future looking back. And here I think I'm in really safe company because this type of writing or thinking is not quite alien to this part of the world. I mean, I remember al-Qura of Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi, where he envisages some kind of meeting in Mecca where a new pan-Islamic order comes about. That's a kind of looking back from the future. So I'd like to start by saying, what would an economic historian, a political economist, a public sector manager, a private businessman, a student, a agriculturalist, what would they say if they come together in this hall, assuming it's still around? I hope it will be around in 2040. How will they look back at the past 20 years? And what would be their conversation? Would they talk about lost opportunities? Would they talk about roads not taken? Will they talk about what could have happened but didn't happen? Will they still be talking about decay of public institutions? Will they still be talking about corruption? Will they still be talking about inequalities? Will they still be talking about poverty incidents? Will they still be talking about environmental degradation? Will they still be talking about divisions and conflicts between ethnicities and sects and races? What will they be talking about? And this made me think, actually, and as to what are the realistic ways out of the present conundrum that we have. And here I think it requires really a great leap of imagination and a great leap of leadership to try to envisage these 4 countries, previously 5, of the post-Ottoman order and try to find for themselves a set of allegiances and alliances that would allow them to move into the comity of modern developed nations. From the perspective of either Iraq or possibly Lebanon and Syria, there are really 4 points of the compass. One looks north towards, regionally towards Turkey and beyond. The other one looks east towards Iran and beyond. The other one looks south to the petrodollars and the GCC. And the other one looks west towards the Western world. These are the 4 points of the compass which seem to seize the imagination. And I think they don't really seize it, but they stifle it. From my perspective, I think these 4 points of the compass are deeply flawed. Each one of them has its own issues, each one of them has its own problems, but each one of them certainly gives cause to pause because it implies dependence. It implies an allegiance to a set of powers and alliances that lie outside of this region. So I prefer to look inward. I prefer to see what these 4 countries, in one shape or form or another, how can they come together so that they transcend the parts and become greater than the sum of the parts. So the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Of course, everybody can easily point out the problems. People can talk about the ethno-sectarian divisions of Iraq. They can talk about the Syrian war and civil war. They can talk about the problems, various factions and groups and groupuscules of this country. They can talk about the divisions in Jordan and come to the conclusion that the whole thing is just a waste of time, that we will just repeat the past. I don't think so. I think that it's a matter of leadership, and it's a matter of recognizing what opportunities lie within these boundaries of these states, and how these states can come together in a way that will transcend the differences and at the same time give full rights and security to those who feel that they have lost their rights or feel insecure. So, I mean, the economics of regional integration are really, I don't want to get too much into that, but they're quite well known. I mean, people enter into regional economic agreements in order to reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers and to allow for the free flow of goods and services and what are known as factors of production between these countries. And in theory, at least, economic integration benefits all. But of course, there's a counter-argument that if you have economic blocs that work within themselves, they become barriers to dealing with other countries, with other blocs. But by and large, the experience of the most important regional economic bloc, which is that of the European Union, has proved very, very clearly that the benefits far, far outweigh the losses, and that it is a surefire way of avoiding intra-regional conflicts and divisions. So, by and large, there's no doubt that economic integration is a good thing. But why these particular countries? I mean, what brings these countries together? Why should Iraq throw its lot with Lebanon? Why should Lebanon throw its lot with Syria or Jordan, in contrast to a different set of groups, a different set of alliances? And here I think the argument is more complex. It's not so easy to make. The Arab League has failed as an economic organization. Of course, it's failed miserably as a political organization, but that's really not the issue here. The reason why it failed as an economic organization, apart from the huge number of pointless summits on Arab economic integration, common markets, the pan-Arab free trade area, and all of that, they really mean very little in terms of the effect on the national economies of the Arab world. The Arab world as a whole is a very indistinct area. It spreads across really a spectrum of countries and even civilizations where the parts have different kinds of magnets that connect them. The Maghreb is connected far more closely to the European Union than it is to countries of the Mashriq, and so on and so forth. Each of these elements, geography being the greatest enemy here for the kind of integration that patently failed in the case of the Arab League. Here is different, I think. Here there are there is a common history. I mean, it's a history too of Ottoman occupation of 500 years. But by and large, this part of the world has been part of one empire or another as a contiguous unit. So if you look at the patterns of history before the emergence of the colonial powers in the area, there is a kind of common historical legacy. There are two different civilizational spheres here. One is, I would call, the riverine culture of Mesopotamia, which has its own rules and its own flavor, its own taste. And the other one is the Levantine world of Lebanon and Syria, which has its own axes. But these two axes were not in conflict with each other. As I said, by and large, they were composed, they became part of empires that ruled both simultaneously. So they do have a common administrative history, if you want to call it that. At the same time, I think the countries are not so disparate in terms of the disproportionate power. For example, NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Area, has great disparity of power. The United States on one hand, and on the other hand, countries like Mexico, which is by any standard an emerging or a developing country. The power and scope of the United States overwhelms the structures of NAFTA. The European Union also has very, very divergent countries, far more divergent than we have here. For example, the difference between Sweden or Finland and Portugal is much, much greater, both in terms of economics, in terms of culture, in terms of language, in terms of whatever rule that you want to use, than, for example, Iraq and Syria, or Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. I mean, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan historically are one common culture with nuances and differences that over time became more substantial. Now, none of these economies, as I said, overwhelms the other. None of them has a preeminence and predominance so that it creates an overwhelming superiority. So that if you join an alliance of this kind between unequal partners, an alliance between China and Vietnam is unequal almost by definition. And there has to be a very, very good reason why the weaker party joins the larger party. Here, I think that there is, of course, a smaller party. I mean, the smallest party in this grouping would be Lebanon. And here the population is, about 7 million people. But Lebanon has a relatively high per capita income, probably the highest amongst these four countries. But by and large, you have Iraq on one side, accounting for something like 38 million people, followed by Syria, a population of around, maybe, I don't know what it is now, perhaps 20 million people. Then Jordan, maybe around 9 to 10 million people, and Lebanon. So we have the basis here, I think, both in terms of language, in terms of a common history, in terms of a non-disproportionate scale of the economy, to talk about the possibility of an economic union. Now, this economic union, obviously you say, well, what happened to the Maghreb's economic union? I mean, the frontiers between Morocco and Algeria were closed for decades on end. The frontiers also, by the way, between Iraq and, for example, Iraq and Syria, have been closed, I think, since 1978. From time to time, they're open temporarily. I think they're opened in the 1990s for a while. Of course, between Jordan and Syria in the last few years, they've been closed as a result of the war in Syria, and also Jordan is a kind of launching pad for the opposition. And Syria and Lebanon, as we all know, is subject to the whims of various powers that be. It opens and closes at will. But that doesn't really preclude the possibility of thinking outside of the box here. So if we look at the frame of a West Asia Economic Union, and if you look at the stages of economic integration, the most basic step is a free trade area. And by free trade area, it means that there is free trade, by definition, of goods, maybe also of services, but each country has the ability to maintain its tariffs and its duties with respect to third parties. Free trade areas, there are many free trade areas around the world. We mentioned the North America Free Trade Area. ASEAN in Southeast Asia has a type of type of free trade area. The Andean Pact countries started off as a free trade area, and they might move to another level, which is a second level, which is to have a customs union. A customs union is one in which there is a free flow of goods and services within the countries and a kind of common tariff to the outside world. The third degree of integration, as it were, is the integration in the form of a common market. And the common market here is that not only do you have a common policy, a common trade policy to the outside world and elimination of free trade of goods and services, but also free movement of all factors of production. So people working in Iraq, for example, can come and work in this country, and Lebanese can come and work in Jordan, Jordanians can come and work in Iraq without the need for any of the administrative routines of work permits and so on and so forth. So it's a free movement of all factors of production, including money. And this is really quite significant, because without a free flow of capital within regional economic units, the idea of integration begins to lose its strength, its propensity. And the last form of economic integration, before we get into political union, is an economic union. And in an economic union here, policies are integrated, not only in terms of free flow of goods and services, a common external tariff, but also in terms of a common set of agreements, common policies affecting economic and social life, and moving towards a currency union. Now, in the case of Western Europe, this took something like maybe 30 years before it evolved. It evolved from the first agreement, which is the coal and steel agreement, then in 1951, which then moved to the common market proper in 1957, which then moved to the European Economic Area through the various treaties, and then moved to a currency union with the Treaty of Maastricht and so on. Here, looking back again from the vantage point of 2040, something around 2020, let's envisage the leaders get together and declare something called the West Asia Economic Union, and we call it the Baghdad Treaty, where the founding members are Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, where they map out the various phases of economic union, starting from a free trade area, moving towards a common market, moving towards an economic union, and finally moving to some form of not political union, but political coordination. Now, again, looking at the patterns of countries with disparate types of economies and disparate sizes of economies, and to see what has happened to them. ASEAN, which I know very well because I lived and worked in Singapore for a long time. The ASEAN groups completely disparate countries. Singapore has probably the highest per capita income in the world. I know Qatar does, but Singapore is a real country with real people in there who are the majority of this. And they have quite a broad-based economy in finance and transport and shipping and so on. They have a per capita income probably in the region now, I don't know, maybe $70,000, $80,000. On the other, a few hundred miles down the Bay of Bengal, you end up with Myanmar, which is a military dictatorship, which has the most terrible human rights record, but has been included in the ASEAN groupings of countries. North, you have Vietnam, which had emerged out of decades of war, and now is one of the most significant member of ASEAN. So the disparate nature of these countries is much, much greater than what we have here in what I call the West Asia Economic Union. There you have the smallest principality, which is Brunei. It's like sort of the Abu Dhabi of the Far East, is merged with a country like Indonesia, which is the typical example of a developing or an emerging country. And over a period of time, ASEAN evolved, not necessarily in the same direction as the European Union, but now has really quite a significant set of common policies that govern its foreign policies and its economic policies. And intra-regional trade between these countries moved from really a very, very low level, perhaps as low as we have here. If you take out oil and oil products, intra-regional trade in the Middle East is insignificant. It's probably around 8 to 10% of total trade, to something in ASEAN now of around 40 or 50%. So the example that we have is that there is no reason why we should not have a Baghdad Treaty of 2020 in which a West Asian Economic Union is announced with a clear timetable and a clear set of milestones that moves from a declaration of principles to a free trade area, to a customs union, to a common market, and then ultimately to some form of currency union. Each of these areas of the world has its own peculiarities. There's no cookie cutter approach to it. The Mercosur, for example, in South America, which groups Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, is different from the Andean Pact, which is again different from NAFTA. It is tailor-made to the needs and requirements of these countries. What I think should be done here in this part of the world, assuming the leadership and the vision is there, is that once you make the declaration of principle, you don't necessarily pull out of the Arab League, but you approach the matter in a pragmatic, realistic way that allows you to manage your economies in ways that are to the benefit of the people generally. Here, I think, in the case of the West Asia area, economic area, we should think in terms of a sectoral approach to integration rather than an institutional or a policy approach to integration. And by that I mean as follows. In most of the countries that I just alluded to, for example in Europe, it was a set of institutional frameworks that were put in place with policy prescriptions attached to it that governed already existing enterprises and already existing firms and created the framework in which these grew in a unified and a growing market. Here, we don't have the economic base for that. We don't have the business base for that. We don't have the corporate base for that. We don't have a history or a legacy. We may have had a past legacy in which these things happened, but these are just memories now. The memories of Lebanese businessmen working in Iraq and actual working and investing and creating value, or Iraqis spending money on tourism projects in this country, or Jordanians working in Syria. That memory is not now matched by a reality on the ground, because the nature of the economies has moved really dramatically in the Middle East in the last 20 years to economies that are driven by and large by what is known in economic terms as elite capture. Small groups of people, whether they are military-based, whether they are ethnocentric-based, whether they are sectarian-based, control the levers of economic power and reach the point where huge amounts of resources are diverted to a very, very few people, creating in their wake massive distortions and dislocations. The economies of the Middle East are, I think, a typical example of elite capture economies. And elite capture economies, of course, reach certain apogees that are very difficult to actually believe in. I mean, I was looking at some statistics from the World Bank, which showed you the extent to which these elite economies, how they actually function, elite capture economies. In Tunisia, for example, the Ben Ali family accounted for 16% of the net profits generated in that country. Now, if you think about it, this is such an enormous amount of resource transfer. So the entire structure of the economy and the economies of the area are twisted in order to achieve the gains or the pecuniary requirements of those in power. We have elite capture economies in this part of the world. These four countries, to a lesser or greater extent, exhibit nearly all of the characteristics of elite capture. Elite capture economies obviously have to be dismantled if we're going to get anywhere, because the firms do not operate, the companies do not operate, and businessmen do not operate according to the rules of the marketplace. They operate according to the rules of access to power and using power in order to divert resources and to utilize resources in ways that are completely uneconomic. I'm speaking now not in moral terms, but in economic terms. So the institutional route is likely to fail. There's no point having all kinds of laws for free trade if they're distorted and changed. So my proposal here, looking back again from 2040, is that having analyzed and looked at the economies of the area, the movers and shakers, the great and the good, and the best and the brightest, have decided not to go the institutional policy route, but have gone through the sectoral route. What do I mean by the sectoral route? The sectoral route here is to define and design large-scale investments, infrastructure investments in particular, that have the basis of creating the units of economic integration. Now, what are these? I mean, obviously you can go down, make a laundry list of what you want. And you start off, for example, with a regional power grid. That, of course, implies a common power policy. It implies a common energy policy. You can start also with a series of integrating the transport networks, the highway networks of the area, enlarging and expanding the highways and motorways that connect the area. That would require a common transport policy. It would require a common set of agreements that define that. You can have, for example, the West Asia Ports Treaty, whereby the ports of the area, looking at the Gulf, what I call the Gulf of Basra, you have the ports of the Basra region, you have the ports of the Mediterranean littoral, and you have Aqaba, that have a common set of shipping documents, a common set of through transit of goods. This is one of the first things that happened in Europe, by the way, where both Rotterdam and Antwerp, which are at the mouths of the River Rhine, had a common set of shipping documents from 1946, and they in fact preceded the economic and the steel and coal community. Or you can have, for example, agreements relating to the transport and distribution of oil products and pipelines. This seems to be happening now, with the talk about the Iraq Aqaba pipeline and the reopening of the old IPC pipeline to Banyas and to Tripoli. And I believe the recent visit of the Speaker of Parliament of Lebanon to Iraq is to do with that pipeline idea. Of course, with a common pipeline energy policy, you have to have a policy regarding where the main oil exports of Iraq are going to go. So you have to bring that country into the equation. Obviously, there's no point having a pipeline policy if the main oil producer is not going to use it. But here we're talking about a growing oil production in Iraq, probably reaching something like 5.5, 6 million barrels in about a decade's time within this vision here, where you would need to have a complex network of pipelines. With pipelines come refineries. With refineries come all kinds of ancillary products and downstream products. But what I think is one of the things that should be done when the time comes to review this policy is to situate all of these sectoral agreements that govern the development of key aspects of the economy in what are the most advanced technologies of the time. I mean, there's no point doing refineries, for example, if there's a collapse in demand for oil products sometime in 2025, 2030. Everybody talks about now peak oil, but nobody knows at what rate this is going to decline. It might decline at a very, very rapid rate. In fact, it will be a disaster for Iraq especially, and I think for the region as a whole, if it collapses, if the demand for oil and oil products falls within 10 years. We'd have a very, very serious problem here, really, because we're not prepared for it. We're not prepared for the mass movement of transport, for example. Nearly 60% of oil goes into transport. If the transport sector shifts in a dramatic way from using petroleum products to electrical cars, for example, in spite of the demand, the short-term growth in demand, there will be a huge secular decline in demand. And when secular declines happen, it is usually a catastrophic collapse happens soon after. I mean, the cars competed with horse and carriage for about 10 years. People were still debating whether it's better to have a horse or whether to have a car. But somewhere around 1905, 1906, the demand for carriages collapsed. So with that, saddle makers and all of that. What I think we should look at very, very seriously is what I have discussed prior, I've called it one of the major institutional infrastructure projects that could be developed here to bind this region together. I call it the Great Mediterranean Gulf Greenway. Now, what does that really imply? It implies the development and construction of a water-based transportation network that would link the Euphrates Valley with the Asi River to create a contiguous transport and irrigation network that connects the Gulf of Basra with the Mediterranean coast. Now, this project, which I've tried to develop and talk about for some time, its significance is not so much to act as a kind of, because at some point, from one perspective, it would appear to be some kind of madcap scheme, like another Suez Canal. But here we're talking about 900 miles. The cost of developing that canal or that structure by itself cannot be possibly one that would make an adequate return in a reasonable period of time. But it's a corridor. And when I talk about it as a corridor, I imply that it's not only for irrigation purposes, in which case there has to be an entire system of water management that involves the upper Euphrates and the Tigris River, but also a transportation system, a transportation canal, maybe a dry canal, in which there will be integration between the transport systems, the port systems, and the rail systems of the area. With this kind of corridor, and this I can discuss it at much greater length if at some later date. I hope to write an essay about it. I see this as a kind of millennial project that would bring all elements that combine to form the sinews of a modern economy in the construction and development of the area that would be included in that transport and irrigation corridor. So this would be the type of project that I would hope in 10 years' time would be seriously considered to anchor the West Asia Economic Union. One in which green technologies will be brought in, anti-desertification schemes will be brought in. And in fact, if that corridor is established, it could be a magnet for what I would call colonizing the desert. The surplus populations of the urban areas of the entire region can be drawn into a corridor that would use solar energy, that would use the most advanced desert agriculture, that would utilize emerging technologies that convert saline water into water fit for irrigation, with a dry canal that would link the Gulf with the Mediterranean and create an addition, not necessarily an alternative, to the Suez Canal. Now, dry canals are something that have been tried and tested. It's not something that's sort of a cockamamie scheme. Projects of this kind, of course, we're at a very, very early stage, but you have to imagine these things and think outside of the box. What are you going to do with the population explosion that we have in this area? Iraq's population is now nearly 40 million people. They're nearly all dependent on oil income. Without oil income, as we're talking with Professor Bashar, Iraq's per capita income will be lower than Burundi's. It will be one of the poorest countries in the world. There's really nothing there apart from oil. Agriculture has been decimated. Industry doesn't exist. The place is flooded with third-rate goods from all kinds of countries. And money flies out of it into various banking systems around the area. This is one aspect of it. The other aspect of this sort of integrative sectoral approach towards creating the basis of an economic union is to do with creating a transport network that will bind the countries together very, very tightly in a highway, rail, and perhaps even air system, and one that connects this region with the rest of the world. Finance also is really critical here. And here, I suppose we look at Lebanon as acting as a financial gateway to the area. Sorry. I think somewhere around 2030, if we have the right vision, and we're moving in the right direction, and we have reached the point where there is free flow of goods and services and a free flow of labor and people. Maybe we can start with professions and then go down scale to normal workers, where there's no residency requirement and freedom of movement. At that point, obviously, the next step is some form of currency union in the area. And here, I think this country can play really an important part, because they have it is the main source of financial skills and financial institutions, probably in the Middle East outside of the Gulf area. And given the larger canvas upon which the banking and financial sector can operate here, I would not be remiss in thinking that perhaps Beirut would be the center for the new regional central bank that will have some kind of West Asia dinar currency, and that would act as another element in bringing the economies and societies of the area. Here, I think also we should think of a regional development bank that goes beyond the Arab Fund or the various, the Arab Monetary Fund, for example, in Abu Dhabi, or the Arab Fund in Kuwait. And here the Regional Development Bank will be both a development and a reconstruction bank. It will be mainly tasked towards financing reconstruction needs, mainly of the Syrian economy and to much lesser extent of Iraq, but also to finance regional projects or projects of a regional significance. I would envisage, for example, Jordan as being a kind of innovation center for the area as a whole, and that the whole slew of incentives, the institutions related to venture capital, related to funding of entrepreneurs in the tech sector, would be given a big fillip there. And it would act as a kind of focal point for all R&D work and work related to technology and technology enhancement of the area. The other thing that I would like to talk about are the resources that are embedded underneath the desert sands of the Anbar and the eastern Syrian desert. There is a massive aquifer there, probably the same size as the Kufra oasis, that has been discovered through aerial photography. And one of the few worthwhile projects of Muammar Gaddafi was this the grand man-made river, which brought large amounts of water from the Sahara for irrigation and for water supply purposes to the urban areas. This aquifer, if it actually materializes, being the size that we're talking about, it's basically an inland sea that is about one or so miles underneath the surface. It can provide the irrigation requirements for all the areas that I talked about in this Greenway project. And if it can be extended to bring water supplies to both the Iraqi, Syria, and Jordanian areas, then I think we can have the basis for another major enhancement of the economy of the area. I don't know if we have more time.
Yes.
Not lastly, but people always bring out what about the politics? What about the security side? How can this be accommodated in the context of really very different institutional arrangements? Iraq, no matter what you think of it, is really turning into a kind of democracy. It is very difficult to envisage now a coup taking place in Iraq. It's a very brittle, it's a very distorted, it's a very inadequate form of democracy, but it is a kind of democracy. Lebanon, for all of its faults, also has a similar type of structure. Jordan is, I don't know how to describe it, it's a kind of an authoritarian monarchy with a great deal of goodwill. Syria, I don't want to comment, but if the wrong lessons are drawn from the Syrian war, then not much is likely to change. However, if the right lessons are drawn, then there is no reason why we cannot come up with a common set of agreements with a system that may not necessarily be to everybody's liking. But in the area of economic and financial cooperation, I think it's in the manifest interest of all of these parties to come together. Once this happens, it is very likely that there will be a great deal of linkages there. If you eliminate regional rivalries, if you eliminate conflicts between neighbors, if you eliminate people interfering into the affairs of the other countries, you are likely to create the circumstances where good sense might prevail when it comes to matters of security and politics. I mean, I'd like to think that. ASEAN has managed to have a very successful common security policy, even though it combines really disparate countries. As I said, Singapore on one hand, Brunei on the other, Myanmar, they cannot be as different as you can get. There's no reason why this cannot graduate to a form of security and political cooperation beyond the area of economics and finance. So I think we have with us, one last thing before I conclude, is what I believe is the future building blocks of modern economies will no longer be the nation state. I think there will be cities. Cities are far more effective as economic units than cities plus hinterland. This has been proven really quite time and time again. One of the reasons for the success of Singapore, for example, or even Dubai, is the urban orientation of most of or nearly all the economic policies. Here, if we look at the historic cities that we have, you'll find that we have within the configuration of cities in West Asia, the makings of, I think, great urban economies that are likely to thrive in a postmodern, technologically intensive environment. In Iraq, we have the three historic cities of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. We have in Syria, Aleppo and Damascus, and we have the coastal cities of the Eastern Mediterranean, of Beirut and Tripoli and beyond. And of course, Amman has turned itself into a thriving city. Cities account for the majority of economic output, they account for the highest value added, they account for the greatest agglomerations, and an urban-oriented, city-oriented economic policies will only re-anchor the regional trend towards integration. So I'm actually quite optimistic. If we can only get out of this conundrum of constantly repeating the errors of the past and expecting to have a different outcome. The era of confrontations, conflicts, ethno-sectarianism has proven to be disastrous. The alternative, which is some kind of comatose authoritarian governments, is also disastrous. So before I end, I'll just have to ask the question, if you don't think this way, then what is the alternative? The alternative can be really quite bleak. And the alternative ultimately will be one in which we become just playthings of regional powers and regional countries that have no really long-term interest in the welfare and progress of the peoples of the area. It means also that we have to get off the hobby horse. If you look at this combined entity, this whatever you want to call it, the West Asia entity, it will have a population of around 75 million people. But it will be a population that will be actually quite balanced in terms of its ethno-sectarian composition, where no particular group would prevail over the other. When that happens, then the institutions of the region, the institutions of this West Asian area, can be geared towards maximizing or optimizing the harmonization between these groups with supranational institutions. Maybe some kind of court of human rights, maybe some kind of West Asia parliament that would allow for the representation of these groups without each one dominating and domineering. To get to that point, we have to get off where we are now. And where we are now is not in a very happy place. But I really cannot think of an alternative. Continuing along the path of the past will merely reproduce the errors of the past. So, looking back at 2040, if somebody was writing the economic history of this part of the world in 2040, he could actually be writing a very positive story if we follow the right prescriptions and learn from our past as well as the past of other countries. With that, I end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alam. Thanks. Thank you for this hopeful, if not optimistic, vision. I open now the floor for the pessimists and others to voice their questions. Yes, I will. Yes, please. Yeah.
So there is no microphone. I would like to use my voice as loudly as possible. Thank you very much for this optimistic, enriching vision that wasn't only theoretical, it was also practical, as we were able to see the unique role of every country in this region, Lebanon as the financial gate, Jordan as R&D, and so forth. And the pieces were put together very smoothly, and it was very homogeneous. We were able to see that, and I'm very optimistic about it. Thank you for that. And when I'm going back and forth to Iraq, I can see that Lebanese, Syrians are also integrating with the market, although Iraqis being more consumers than producers. But for me, there was something missing, which is the actual question: what is the main role of Israel when it comes to this homogeneous, optimistic future? We never mentioned, would Israel allow that? Is it good for Israel? Is it good for us? Or that's my main question. Can you please elaborate on that point?
I'll take three questions, and then let's take 3 questions, and then we ask our speaker to respond to them. Just we have economize on the time.
Thank you very much, sir, for all what you have mentioned. I have to say I really admire your optimism, definitely. I will try, I have many comments, but I will specify one main question and maybe another comment. Historically, it has been shown that most of the developed countries, currently known as developed countries, had adopted protectionist and interventionist economic policies before going into free trade. And here I'm talking about the US, the UK, Sweden, Japan, you name it. They all had subsidies, tariffas, and they all had policies to connect public and private sectors before going into free trade. So from that point of view, do you think Iraq is ready actually to go into this free trade? Having the fact that we have just been out of war, given the fact that we are still oil-centered economy. And that gets me to the second point. I'm not sure in 10 years there will be even water in Basra, because as you know, there has been, last year there was no water at all. And water and oil, because of the extractivist policies, water management policies adopted by the upper river and basin in Turkey and other places. And also, oil and water does not fit together, because for every barrel of oil, you need a barrel of water to extract. So I'm not sure in 10 years there will be even water. So, and the last question is, who will benefit? Would the people of those countries benefit? Who will benefit from this union? Thank you very much.
You can wait for so we can have it in.
Dr. Allawi, thank you very much for this enlightening concept. It's a dream come true, actually, if it materializes. the point is, this is something I've always thought of, dreamt of, and spoke to some friends about, actually, to having this economic region union. The problem is that what I see, even though it's a dream, what I'd love to see is that, because there's a book, I think, called Enemy on the Euphrates, that took events in history between early 1900s to 1920, mostly in Iraq, and one of those British mustashriqeen, what do you call it? I forgot what their name is. Yeah. He wrote to the foreign ministry, said, we have to be careful because let's say from the Gulf all the way to Morocco, they have one unified, you can go all the way across, you can speak one language, there's one religion, whatever, and we have to make sure that we divide this region, make sure that that we have problems, we need to create a cancer cell, which became Israel, of course, to prevent this problem. But how do you want to go about, are you going to promote this personally? Are you going by giving lectures? Are you going to talk to political people to make this happen? Because it's really, in my opinion, it's a great idea. It's fantastic. I'd love to see this come true. So I don't know.
Thank you. I think we can take that. We can take the question now. We'll go for a second round after. Yeah, so.
With regards to Israel and the United States and great powers and so on, I think they would be very violently against it. But so what? I mean, the US under Trump is looking at regional units, starting from the European Union and their attack on NAFTA and so on, because they recognize that it's a form of divide and rule. It's much easier for the US to dominate a nation state than it is to dominate an agglomeration of countries. Israel is dead set against it, I think. I mean, they're dead set against any kind of economic development of the area. They are advocates of chaos, and I won't say managed chaos, but total chaos, and they can hide behind their iron wall to stop the spread of chaos. But I'd say, so what? I say that as an individual, but as a political animal, they're going to use their best efforts directly and through the United States, and the United States under Trump will probably go along to block this thing from happening. I think that you can actually, there still is a undercurrent of support for multilateral institutions inside the United States, and I think you can appeal to that. You have to play the politics properly. The spirit of the times is against large regional institutions. So from that point of view, I think it will be problematic. I think the lady's questions here are really very well put. You said that the free trade came after protectionist, interventionist policies that built up domestic capital and domestic enterprise. That's true. I mean, historically, it's true in most cases. The U.S. had one of the highest, tariff rates until very recently. Britain, of course, is different. It was always going for free trade and the corn laws and all of that. But it's not necessarily an economic policy that is always correct. This kind of building up domestic industries at a very low level, avoiding any economies of scale behind large tariff barriers, is a kind of Prebician approach of the 1960s, a kind of import substitution policies. Here, I don't think there's much to protect, frankly. There isn't any world-class industry or even regional industries of any consequence that need or can be protected. Also, the capitalist classes here, the business classes, are not necessarily rooted into a kind of sort of enterprise focus. They're more into rentier, economic rent type of approach. So I think you can skip over all of that. A kind of common tariff that is reasonable, that does not take place at the expense of the consumer, in order to create the beginnings of viable industries here. With a largish market, we're talking about a market of around 70, 80 million people, which is the same size of the market in Turkey. If we have the proper agreements with Europe and the Far East, we might be able to have access, duty-free access to some of these markets, and it will create the incentive, I think, to create regional industries by our business people. Which answers your third question, who will benefit? I think who will benefit in the long run are the common people of this part of the world. I mean, the economies will be diversified, they'll be competitive, there'll be large-scale sources of employment outside of the public sector. The kind of budget-draining subsidies that have destroyed the social contract and were part of the reason behind, I think, the Arab Spring is the loss of energy subsidies, the loss of food subsidies, and the state being the employer of not last resort, but of first choice. This came at huge fiscal cost. So I think growing the private sector is an essential element of this approach. The water issues of Iraq and Basra, I mean, luckily we had a good year this year, but it is really to do with mismanagement more than ecological and climate change. It is grossly mismanaged resource. There's a huge amount of waste. There's a huge amount of underinvestment. There's terrible maintenance of the water resource system. Obviously, all of this has to be rationalized and improved. But the way that I looked at it is, what are we going to do with this massive, if it comes about? And there's very good evidence that there is this kind of massive aquifer that will allow for really a revolution in the water management of the area. Again, I'm looking 10 years down the line. Maybe next year there will not be water in Basra. So this will be something that has to be looked at immediately. Now, the last question is whether I'm promoting this. Yes, actually, I've been trying to promote this for the last year. Is that I've been trying to create a kind of groundswell of interest amongst, call them opinion leaders here, politicians, intellectuals, business people, bankers, students, to create a kind of groundswell for a regional movement that would push the leaderships here to look into this thing very seriously. Now, the European Union project really was the brainchild of two people, a man called Jean Monnet, and he convinced Robert Schuman, who's the foreign minister, and they convinced the United States, and it was a post-war environment and the Marshall Plan, and there was huge willingness to listen to the United States. So the first step was the European Coal and Steel Community. But if you talk about the differences between Iraq and Syria over time, they're nothing like between Germany and France. And these guys have been fighting wars since the days of Napoleon. So I think that it's something that I'm trying to form a groundswell. And in fact, I was supposed to be attached to this institute for that purpose. But I've now talked to several people in Jordan about this, and in Iraq, obviously, and here in Lebanon, we're just starting. In Syria, unfortunately, I don't have access yet. But I think there should be a kind of movement or some kind of association which promotes this and backs this and educates people for it, so that this message can grow and continue over time.
Open the floor for a second round. Yes, the Faqar, please. We have time.
First of all, by the name of Iraqi Culture Club, I would really like to appreciate the efforts that you gave today in your talk and visualizing this optimistic vision. My only question is, in your opinion, what is the estimated amount of budget needed to build that Mediterranean grain canal? Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Allawi, thank you very much for your speech. My name is Sharif Al-Bazaz. Just a quick point. You mentioned regarding Europe is going into electric cars and everyone is moving into more environmental and green stuff. Iraq worries independence actually in terms of oil, and this is where the region in the Middle East, we depend on it. What do you see, or how do you see in 20 years or 30 years, Iraq will depend other than oil alternative? Because you mentioned this very key point that the world is changing into electric cars and stuff like this. We'd like to know your point of view. Thank you.
Yeah, yes, please.
Dr. Allawi, thank you very much. Of course, Iraq would be probably the most important constituent of this grand vision. And I think you would be one of the few people who would be able to send this idea to the Iraqi leadership. So I think that's something certainly to concentrate on. As far as the Iraqi Cultural Club may be able to offer a social media hub for to propagate this idea. So good luck. Go ahead.
So you can have the Iraqi club with a linchpin of Middle East Confederation. Yes.
Another question, which is not related to Israel, but this time is related to other neighboring countries such as Iran and Saudi Arabia. I'm not focusing much on Turkey, but would Iran and Saudi Arabia also withstand this unity, a strong Iraq? Would they accept that? Is it going to be easy on them? What is going to be their view as well?
Can I will add my question, since this is the final round. I mean, I think it's great to think outside the box and great to be optimist. I think there is a room for thinking along these lines. But I wonder if one can actually also include the capturing elite in the vision. Since the capturing elite are here, and maybe are here to stay in some countries, why can't they benefit themselves from this vision? Are we supposed to throw them out, which is going to be very costly? That applies also to Iran, Saudi Arabia. They can also benefit from a flourishing. I'm anti-conspiratorial in that sense. I don't think even the Israelis and the Americans are so scared of a well-functioning zone. So I'm more optimistic than you, but I'm thinking, why can't we, why hasn't it happened? Why isn't it the capturing elite think that this kind of integration, since you mentioned Myanmar and other countries that have capturing elite and entered into economic zones that are successful, why can't we have this that will benefit the capturing elite in an unfair way, but it will also trickle down or up or sideways to the population? So can we sell it to the corrupt? Can we sell it to the current ruling elite, which is struggling itself with tight budgets and with demands, whether it's in Jordan, whether it's in Lebanon, whether it's in Iraq, whether it's in Syria, of course, as well, despite the Syria is still in a kind of big hole now. So why can't we, what are the impediments, in other words? Or is there are no impediments? All they have to do is to realize their own self-interest in it and just enter it.
I'll start with the first question about this Great Mediterranean Gulf Greenway. I'll just read out what I have written before as to the elements of it. What are the main principles behind it? It will be firmly rooted in the use of environmentally and ecologically sound principles. It will employ the most advanced tested technologies and systems that are integrated together to produce effective and economic outcomes. It will be based on the principle of sustainability. It will be dynamically focused, accommodating upgrades, changes, and new systems and processes. It will be based on the creation of cluster magnets for agglomerations and the development and evolution of new towns and cities. It will be based on the principles of modularity and scaling. It will produce a meaningful, positive effect on the climate and on reversing desertification. Elements of the Greenway. The central axis of the Greenway is a navigation canal running when fully connected from the head of the Gulf to the Mediterranean coast, a distance of nearly 1,400 kilometers. The canal will run through a system of locks with long flat stretches running through the southern and western Iraqi desert, the Syrian desert before reaching the Mediterranean. The canal will cut nearly 1,500 kilometers of the route between Europe and India, in contrast to the Suez Canal. The canal could be using fresh or seawater. 2, the seawater drawn from the canal will be the basis for a horticultural industry, utilizing technologies that use seawater to cool and provide a humid growing climate for vegetables under glass houses. The runoff seawater will be purified further with desalination technologies, resulting in water suitable for irrigation and byproducts of marketable salts and minerals. The energy to drive the glass houses' desalination irrigation systems will be based on solar power. The purified water will form the basis of extensive open-air farming using drip irrigation systems. The system will include wide-scale planting of trees, especially palm varieties, to create an extensive tree-forest barrier to creeping desertification. The canal spine of the Great Greenway will form the heart of a network of subsidiary canals that link the Greenway to the main population centers to form a comprehensive transportation network. At strategic nodes along the canal network, special resource processing and storage zones will be developed, partly to utilize the undeveloped resources of the desert regions of Iraq and Syria, especially the natural gas deposits and the phosphates and other mineral resources. Alongside the main canal and its tributaries, new clusters of villages and towns will be developed based on holistic principles of harmony and acoustics. Migration from densely populated urban areas, displaced peoples, and the rural landless will be encouraged as part of the plan to rebalance the area's population and work and living opportunities. The Greenway will be the hub for industries that will focus on the opportunities afforded by the construction and development of the Greenway. These could include technology systems and processes in the field of alternative power, reverse desertification, water resource management, canal construction and maintenance, horticulture and agriculture under difficult climatic conditions, and so on. The Greenway Zone will encourage the evolution of higher institutes of learning and research relevant to the development and consolidation of this visionary project for the renewal of the Middle East. My estimate is that this is transformative projects. As in all transformative projects, such as the Panama Canal, the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the building of the new capital of Brazil, for example, the Greenway will have to be staged over a period of time, stretching to several decades. It is a multi-generational project requiring the consensus of several governments and even international bodies before it can be realized in its full potential. My estimate, I don't go any further, my estimate, it will cost in total around $20 billion when it's fully constructed. I think it is within the investment budgets of the 4 countries concerned. So it is not an outlandishly expensive idea. The second question related to oil and what will happen. I think we must do something that is of a transformative nature, because the Iraqi economy cannot sustain loss of oil revenues. It can't. Our agriculture is in very, very poor situation. There is no industrial base to speak of. The services sector is very poor. That is one of the reasons I'm mentioning. I mean, this may not be the only project, but a transformative project that can reorient the axis of the economy, preferably of the region, because you can't, no man is an island unto himself. We have to think this way. I think Iraq has to embark on a transformational set of economic policies over the next 5 years, which in my mind must revolve around something like this, or a massive investment in the transport and infrastructure side. Nasser Beg, you asked about sell this idea to the Iraqi leadership, or somebody else did. Sorry, I think Haidar did. I mean, I've tried, and I think perhaps, by the way, Iraq's leadership, 3 of the last 5 prime ministers were half Lebanese. I don't know if you are aware of that. I mean, Ayad Allawi, Haidar al-Abadi, and Adil al-Mahdi. So the basis of unity is there anyway. Iran and Saudi Arabia, I don't know what they will think, really. I think Iran, one of the items I wanted to talk about here, I didn't have time, is how do you sell it to these people? And I think you have to reach some kind of association agreement with not only Iran, but with Iran, Turkey, GCC countries, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, of course. If you're going to do this thing, Egypt's going to feel threatened. So there's plenty of examples of, it depends at what level they want to engage with you. If they want to engage with you in order to dominate you, then there's no place you can't argue. But if they want to be in a win-win situation, then I think, Iraq-Iran trade now is around $20 billion, which is a lot. Iranians will obviously think about loss of markets and so on. But if you reach a free trade agreement between them and your bloc, then actually the market will be bigger. So Saudi Arabia is just beginning to enter the Iraqi market, so it's less problematic. Their issues are different. Another question, if I can find it. I think it's to do with yours, Professor. Yeah. This is always an issue, whether you should try to co-opt those with money and power. It's obviously easier. But they will feel, I think to some extent they will feel threatened, because the elites here, with some exceptions, unlike those in the Far East, for example. Thailand is an extremely corrupt country. But the elites are usually related to big industrial financial combines. So when you talk about capture in Southeast Asia, you're talking about people who have some advantage for their firms, either by banning certain kinds of imports. For example, the elite capture in Indonesia, in the cement industry, they basically banned the imports of cement in order to create an artificial price differential, which benefited two families, which benefited Suharto. We don't have that here. We don't have elites that are large employers who are in charge of business firms, who seek favors and benefits from the state in order to protect their domestic market. In some cases you do, but elites here in this part of the world generally feed off the public budget, not by creating distortions from which they particularly benefit for their own value-added businesses, but to basically transfer resources from the state without any value added. I'm speaking as an economist, not as a moral philosopher. There, it requires a change of policy. Elites, for example, in Indonesia, who agreed to open up the market, the enticement was that you have a larger market. All you need to do is to improve the efficiency of your business. You have a larger market, you have access to a larger market. So by and large, they went along. Similarly for elites well, that's the best example. Here, it would require a fundamental recalibration. If you are able to give them an economic incentive through an enterprise, then maybe that's true. That can happen. But I don't know elites in this part of the world that have created, maybe in Syria before the war, that created enterprises and businesses which allowed them to make super profits as a result of their control or influence over government policies.
But isn't it a double-edged thing in the sense that if they don't have an enterprise and therefore they have no interest in protecting the enterprise, they'll be also benefiting or at least not harmed by a greater zone, economic zone. So they don't need to protect, unlike the Indonesian firms. So it's a kind of, the fact that they don't have enterprises makes them, generates income for the government. That gives them more resources to.
I think here in this country, for example, I would try to get the banks on my side because they are the most likely to benefit. Yeah. Jordan, I don't know, they have quite an advanced food processing industry. And it seemed to have done reasonably well in spite of international competition. So if I get them a larger market with a common tariff, then they might be able to
But what Syria?
come along.
The more
Syria,
difficult part.
I don't know how they're going to reconstruct their economy. I really don't know. I don't know how it will be reconstructed. Still very early days of Syria.
Any more questions? Yes. We'll take a last quick round, so please keep your questions short if possible, so we can.
Thank you very much. It's more of a comment than a question, and this thing is coming to pieces. So I'll try to talk loudly. It's more of a comment, really, and I really believe that one has to focus on the how, because as several colleagues mentioned, economic integration in the region has been tried several times and it failed. And so the emphasis should be on the how. Otherwise, we might be accused, it's a beautiful dream, it's a beautiful idea, wonderful. But if we don't focus on the how, then we might be accused of producing another myth. And our region has been very famous for producing myths. One of them is that many people in this hall will probably go to paradise because they are intrinsically good and fine. But at least they tell us how to get there. We have to either pray 5 times a day or do so many Hail Marys, etc. In this situation, it is not like that, and we have to focus on the how. And maybe as Dr. Haider mentioned, get some of the antagonists interested, and I certainly don't mean Israel. Thank you.
Why don't we go all the way, get Turkey and Iran in the deal, so that make it a real grandiose economic center?
I think we can. These are the last questions. So
I think the how you're absolutely right. I mean, this thing can be just another wild scheme by a person who's reaching the end of his productive life. But I hope not. I hope it's not like that. I mean, I've looked at the how, and I think the how this time, instead of going at it politically and institutionally, you go at it sectorally. You focus on a project that has transformative possibilities, and you try to gain people's attention and commitment to that particular project of a transformative nature. Again, ASEAN, as I go back to it. I mean, the Mekong River Authority was part of that process, and it's something that we can do here too. Bringing Turkey and Iran, I think, is at this stage it will create a disjunction. They're different cultures, different languages, and different types of economies. The unit that we have is much more contained, much more consistent, internally consistent. And there's no reason why you cannot have a free trade association agreement with them subsequently, once you form the core. But back to the how, if we don't have the groundswell here of commitment and interest along the wide spectrum of people, including elites, you will not get very far. It will be just another paper in an academic, given an academic conference. Thank you.
You have a question?
Dr. Ahmad Shalabi had a vision of Region 4 that included actually Turkey and Iran. And he was in Beirut and presented the idea, and also at Sam Paris Institute, which wasn't AUB, it was outside.
Yeah.
And I had the opportunity to be there. And the journalist asked him 2 questions. One question, how could he imagine that this thing can happen with the existing geopolitical situation amongst these countries, that it's unthinkable. And his answer was that the seeds the seed of the European Union was installed, planted, instead 2 years after the Second World War. So if that can happen between two countries who had been, as you rightly mentioned, at war for centuries long, and they could start planting that seed of a union just 2 years after the World War, why not? Was his question. The other thing is this cultural difference. And he again emphasized that there are more differences, cultural differences between the European nations as there are between Turkey, Iran, and the Arabs in the region, who have also common unifying, if you like, aspects or factors that can bring them in together also. And he mentioned also the strategic benefits that each one of these powers would be able to capitalize on if this can materialize.
Thank you. You want to comment or?
No, I think I agree with Nasser Beg's comment. I mean, Ahmed Shawqi, Allah yarhamah, was a pioneer in thinking outside of the box, really. And his idea of l'Iqlim al-Rabi', I think, is what you're referring to. To some extent, it's more political than economic. And I think it's probably more doable in the political context to reach an agreement with Turkey and Syria, Turkey and Iran, in a different kind of context. But here I'm looking at it mainly as a phase program that would lead to economic integration within this region. Now, I can't see how you can have a phase program of economic integration with Turkey and Iran unless this unit is established first, from an economic point of view. So it's maybe complementary, I would say. And I think Ahmed was absolutely right. I mean, Jean Monnet, who is the main motor behind the European idea of European Union, was at it actually even before the war. But he, luckily, he joined de Gaulle in 1940. But instead of being in London, he was assigned to Washington. So he spent 3 years with the various economic advisors to Roosevelt, to selling the idea to them. So when World War II ended, the US was primed to some extent to accept the idea of European Union or European. Yeah. So maybe we should
sell it to the American. Maybe we should sell it to
we sell it to Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Last question.
Just last comment, a question. I'm a historian and economist myself, and from Norway. Looking at the European example, I agree with what you say. The US accepting it, or supporting it even, was a key against the Soviet Union in many ways. So to get something off here, I really like your project, would probably at least be helpful to have the European Union supporting it, and Iran, Turkey, and others accepting it for the least. What do you think? Because to do it on your own completely with all these countries against it will be very difficult. To get some real support. And one of the factors I think would be to sell it, or whatever term you would like to use, back in Europe would be stability in the region, and for the Americans maybe against the Islamic State or something, because they have this paranoia about Islamists anyway.
No, I agree with you entirely. I think we must have not a great power sponsor, but an association of economic actors of size and significance. The United States under Trump cannot be one, because they'll be against it. The European Union, I'm sure, will be for it. And maybe there's certain steps will have to be taken to engage with them at a very early stage. But it has to be done at a relatively high level. I'm trying to get the European Bank for EBRD to look at it. But so far, there again, Europe is also obsessed with the Mediterranean and immigration from illegal immigration and all of that. So to them, this is sort of one step further. But I think they would look at it because, as you rightly said, the fear of immigration and the spillover of Syria and the Syrian war and so on. Europe is essential, I think, essential element to maybe even Russia, but Europe is certainly important.
Thank you, Allawi, for the thought-provoking talk, optimistic one as well. It is optimistic, unusual in these times to have optimistic voices. Thank the audience for their patience as well and for their great questions. Thank you very much, and hope the best for the club as well.